Have you ever stopped to think if something as common as the flu could have a deeper, more lasting impact on our health? Well, a really fascinating and pretty important new study has uncovered a surprising connection between common respiratory viruses and cancer. Okay, let's dive right into this. So, this quote, it comes from Dr. Hugh Montgomery. He's a professor of intensive care medicine who, right in the middle of the pandemic, noticed something that was deeply unsettling. He and his colleagues were seeing patients whose cancers were progressing at a speed that was just alarming, almost unbelievable. It was a pattern that didn't fit with anything they knew about how cancer works. And that observation, that gut feeling that something was wrong, led to this huge question. What if the official story wasn't the whole story? What if an infection from a really common virus could actually trigger these dormant, sleeping cancer cells and basically wake them up and cause them to spread? This is the central mystery we're going to try and unravel today. So let's start with the puzzle itself, which really emerged during the pandemic and began with one doctor's deeply personal and tragic story. Now, the prevailing narrative at the time was that the tragic rise in cancer deaths was, because of disruptions in the healthcare system. People were missing screenings, delaying treatments because of lockdowns, and look, that was definitely a factor. But for Dr. Montgomery, this puzzle was also intensely personal. His own sister Rachel, who was in remission from breast cancer, went on a holiday, was unknowingly exposed to SARS-CoV-2. Her health just declined so rapidly, and she passed away from metastatic breast cancer less than 5 months later. So for doctors on the front lines, the official story it didn't explain everything they were witnessing firsthand. Dr. Montgomery was skeptical, to say the least. The sheer speed at which these cancers were advancing just didn't make any sense. This wasn't about a missed mammogram. It really felt like some kind of biological switch had been flipped. He suspected something else was at play here, some kind of trigger that was putting the disease into overdrive. So, to get answers, researchers moved from the clinic, from these real-world observations, into the lab, and they designed this really elegant and simple experiment to see if a virus could actually be the trigger they were looking for. The setup was just brilliant in its simplicity. They started with mice that had dormant breast cancer cells. Just think of them as sleeping cancer cells that had settled in their lungs. Now, normally, these cells would just stay inactive for about a year. Then, they introduced a common respiratory virus, like the flu, or a version of SARS-CoV-2 adapted for mice. And the last step was just to watch and see what happened. The results were absolutely stunning. I mean, instead of taking a year to become active, the dormant cancer cells just exploded into metastatic tumors in just 2 weeks after the flu infection. That is an incredibly dramatic acceleration. So here's the crucial point. This wasn't an effect that was unique to just one virus. Both the flu and SARS-CoV-2 seemed to act as a kind of jumpstart, waking up these sleeping cancer cells. The experiment showed pretty clearly that a viral infection could in fact be the trigger. Okay, so we know what happened in the lab. But the next big question is how? How does a simple respiratory virus wake up a sleeping cancer? Well, the answer seems to lie in our body's own defense system. First, let's just make sure we're on the same page about what we're talking about here. Dormant cancer cells. They're cells that have broken away from an initial tumor, they've traveled through the body, and they've settled somewhere else, maybe in the lungs. They're just sitting there, completely inactive, waiting. Now, when you get a virus, your body fights back with inflammation, right? It's a powerful and totally necessary response to kill the invader. But it turns out this very useful defense mechanism can have a really serious, unintended side effect when those dormant cancer cells are hanging around. One of the researchers put it perfectly. It's not that the virus is causing the cancer mutation. The cancer is already there. It's just asleep. The inflammation from the virus is like someone coming along and just poking those sleeping cells over and over until they finally wake up and start growing. In the process, it seems to be this devastating 1-2 punch. So in the early phase of an infection, your body releases this chemical messenger. It's called interleukin-6 or IL-6 to fight the virus. But that exact same chemical also wakes up the dormant cancer cells. Then, a little later, the body's own cancer-killing T cells get suppressed, which means the newly awakened cancer has this perfect window of opportunity to grow completely unchecked. Of course, mice are not people, so the next critical step for the researchers was to see if this exact same pattern holds true in humans. And to do this, they turned to these massive health databases. And the findings were pretty stark. In the UK Biobank group, which includes thousands of cancer survivors, those who had tested positive for COVID-19 had a nearly twofold increased risk of cancer-related death compared to those who tested negative. That means their risk was basically doubled, and the link was strongest in the first few months right after the infection.
And this wasn't just an isolated finding. They looked at another huge database from the US called Flatiron Health, and they found the exact same pattern. Women who were breast cancer survivors were more likely to see their cancer spread to their lungs after a COVID-19 infection, directly mirroring what they saw in the mice.
So, after all this incredible science, what's the big takeaway? What does this mean for cancer survivors, and really for all of us? Well, the researchers offer some really clear and practical advice. And the advice is actually quite straightforward. First, just understanding that acute infections like the flu can have these long-term consequences. Because of that, anything you can do to limit your chances of getting infected makes a lot of sense. This is why they really emphasize getting your annual flu shot. And hey, even if a vaccine doesn't prevent an infection completely, just reducing how sick you get also reduces the level of inflammation, which, as we've seen, is the real key here. But it's also about balance. Dr. Montgomery, the doctor who started this whole journey, offers this really crucial perspective. He's not saying that cancer survivors should lock themselves away every winter. The goal is not to live in fear, but to be prudent. Because, as he says, no one knows the value of living life more than someone who has faced cancer. And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question. This research has revealed this hidden link between a common virus and cancer, and it's all driven by inflammation. It really makes you wonder, what other common environmental factors, from infections to maybe even pollution, might be acting as these quiet triggers inside our bodies, influencing our long-term health in ways that we are only just beginning to uncover?